Shalom Aleichem and welcome to Mourner Need To Mourn online Smicha to discuss a short halacha on this week's parsha, Parshas וישב. After the brothers came back with the bloody Ksainis passing, and Yaakov identifies it, and it looks like that Yosef's garment is Yosef's garment, and Yosef is torn apart. So the pasuk says, by Perek Lamed Zayin Pasuk Lamed Gimel, by Yakira, he identified it. Vayomer Ksainis B'ni, this is actually the garment of my son. Chaya Ra Chalasoi, a wild animal must have eaten him. Tadayf Yosef. And when Yaakov realizes that, the pasuk goes on to say, Vayikra Yaakov Simleisov, Yaakov tore his own clothing as kriya for a sign of mourning, of avelus. Vayasem sak b'masnav, he wore a sack. Vayisabel b'no yomim rabim, and he mourned for his son Yosef many days. And Rashi says, what's yomim rabim? 22 years until he gets to meet him again. The pasuk goes on to say, Vayakumu kolbana v'chol b'noisav l'nachmai, his other sons and his daughters, and Rashi says who are his daughters, came to comfort him. And he didn't feel comforted by anybody. And the end of the pasuk says, Vayev oisai aviv, and his father also cried. Says Rashi, what father? Who is this? Says Rashi, this was Yitzchak. Yitzchak hayaboicha. Yitzchak would cry. Yaakov. He never sees the pain, the suffering that his son Yaakov is going through. Says Rashi, but Yitzchak himself did not mourn all the halachas of mourning, because Yitzchak knew the truth. Because Yitzchak knew that Yosef was still alive, so a full-fledged avelus he didn't do. But he was mishtatef b'tzarei shel Yosef, and that's why it says vayef, and he cried. This conversation we see two halachas. Halacha number one, this is the discussion in Shulchan Aruch. It's based on the Gemara in Ksubas and the Gemara in Moed Katan. If somebody Nebuch is sitting shiva, because of a relative passing away, does the spouse also have to keep the shiva, or does the spouse also have to show some act of mourning? So the halacha says like this. The Gemara in Moed Katan says, Kol ha'amor b'parshas kohenim shekohen mitamei lehem. Anybody who's considered a relative that a kohen is allowed to be mitamei to them, avel misabel aleim. Avel could mourn for them. But here comes the punchline. Well, kashem shemisabel aleim, just like he could mourn for them, kach misabel al shniim shalahem. So their relative, if their karev is sitting shiva for somebody else, the spouse, the kohen, over there is talking about the kohen, but the spouse, halacha says, also shows signs of mourning. The Rambam in Hilchos Avel, Perek Beis Halacha Dalet says, Kol kroivim shu chayiv l'sabel aleim, hareza misabel imoim bifneim midivrei seifrim. And the Rambam says, for example, Rahman al-Atzlan, if somebody's anicle passes away, then the din is, while your son's present, in the presence of your son, you have to show avelus, chayav l'kroya b'fnei b'noi, or linig avelus b'fanov. But it's not a real avelus like the avel himself. Shalei b'fanov, he doesn't have to show avelus. And Shulchan Aruch Yeridea, in Siman Shin Ayin Dalet Sivav, it says the same thing. That because Nebuch, your son, is sitting shiva, in front of him you show acts of avelus, but not when you're not present in front of him. The Medrash over here by Yitzchak and Yaakov, the Medrash quotes this pasuk Vayev Oisei Aviv, that Yitzchak cried for tzara that Yaakov is going through. So the Medrash says Vayev Oisei Aviv Ze Yitzchak, and the Medrash goes on to say Rab Levi v'Rab Simin Amru Etzloi Hayaboicha, while he's in front of him, they would cry. But Kivan Sheyotza, when Yitzchak left Yaakov, as he left, he actually would do everything like a regular day, and Yitzchak Avinu wouldn't act in a way of Avelis. So why didn't he reveal to his son Yaakov that Yosef is still alive? So the Medrash says, Amar, Yitzchak said to himself, HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo gila loi. For whatever reason, the Eibishter doesn't want him to know that his son is alive. Vani migala loi, and I should tell him. Amar Rab Simon says, Al Shem Kol Shem Misablim Olav Misablim Imoi. Rab Simon, however, says the reason why he showed signs of mourning, he cried in the presence of his son, because Nebuch, when his son is suffering, anybody, a relative to the son, also has to be compassionate and show suffering too. So the first halacha you see is that mitzad avelus, even if Baruch Hashem, this person himself is not the one that's suffering, but if a close relative of his is going, in this case it was Yitzchak's son Yaakov, is convinced that Nebuch has to sit shiva, the father also has to show in front of acts of tshuva, acts of avelus. In this case, it happens to be a little different because Yitzchak knew the truth, and yet Yitzchak wasn't going to be a megala to him, and therefore he did what he did because the halacha is this way. Now, this is a big discussion, because ultimately, if Yitzchak knew the truth, was he even mechuyev ba'avelus? Even the halacha that says that the Zayda has to participate in the son's mourning, that's because if the son Nebuch is sitting, is mourning. But in this case, if he knew the truth that his own son didn't have to, why would he sit shiva? Why would he show, or even vayef? Why would he cry? I mean, he's not mechuyev. This question is asked in a sefer Shema Shlema, and again, there's different answers. The first answer is that the Avos were machmir even in mitzvahs and the Isurim the Rabbanim, but because mid the Rabbanim, a relative of a Avil has to show signs of Avelus, so Yaakov felt that. But from the other hand, we see that Yitzchak knew the truth. If Yitzchak knew the truth, the whole halacha really shouldn't apply here. However, it's also brought in Shailas Teshuvas Teiras Chesed. Reb Shneir Zalman Fratkin, Orach Chaim Simon Yud Zayin. He also asks this question: since Yitzchak knew that Yosef was alive, what's the point of this Chiyav L'Sabalimai? And he gives two answers. Number one is if he wouldn't show signs of mourning, Yaakov would have figured out that Yosef was still alive. And Yitzchak thought that the Eibishter wants Yaakov not to know. So he had to do this for the process. And number two, you're missing something. Over here, there's no word of Avelus. It says, Vayef, he cried with him. He was never feeling bad for the suffering that the trauma that his son is going through. It's not lav dafka midin shel Avelus. So it is b'chlal a whole other issue, especially that's brought in Sefer Priya Adama, that he says, that you look at the pasuk, it says, Vayisabel al b'noi yomim rabim. Yomim rabim, Avelus is basically Shiva, Shloshim, and max 12 months. And over here, Rashi says it was 22 years. It's a different league, it's a different sort of suffering. So obviously, this is not midin avelus. So this is the first halacha you learn from this. That Nebuch, when somebody's a karev of a person is sitting avelus, then his karev also has to show at least before of signs of mourning. Another halacha you learn from this pasuk is whether if there are two or a few people sitting avelus, Rahman al-Flan, on somebody, does one menachem the other? Over here, the pasuk clearly says, "Vayakumu banav u'bnoisov Kol banav v'chol b'nai Yosef l'nachmoi. And the banav were b'nai Yosef, they were brothers to Yosef, even though they knew the truth possibly. But if they were sitting shiva, why did they have a chiyuv to go on to be Menachem Yaakov? And the answer is, perhaps the mitzvah of Nichem Avelim goes from one avel to another avel. But if we say that this is B'nai Yomim Rabim, this is a whole other league, especially when the pasuk says Vayakumu, they stood up after the whole days of. So this is not even the sure raya to this din that one avel is Menachem, another avel. However, if Shlomo Zalman Auerbach brings a raya from a pasuk in Shmuel Beis Yud Beis Chof Dalid, over there it says Vayinachim David es Basheva Ishtoi, and we know that he was Menachem, his wife Batsheva, even though it was about his own son too. So we see that the mitzvah of Nichem Avelim applies from one avel to another avel too.